Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I've got 10 great horror books for you that were adapted into 10 great horror films. Well, actually, it's 9 great horror films and 1 great horror TV show, but I didn't think that was quite snappy enough for the intro. So this is something people ask about in the comments quite a lot. So they ask me my opinions on particular films, and I've mentioned films on the channel in tag videos and things like that. I also did a video a while ago about books that inspired movies where people didn't necessarily know there was a book in the first place. And I did a while ago a video on a Sunday about Terrifier 2 and the difference, I think, between extreme graphic violence in books versus in movies. But it's something I think I'm going to start exploring on the channel a bit more, the movie side of things, and in particular the relationship between books and films. So I've got a video that will be going up, I think sometime next week, where I compare the novel Jack Returns Home by Ted Lewis with the movie it inspired, Get Carter. Today, though, I want to talk about horror movies, and in particular, I've got 10 horror books for you, all of which I thought were fantastic, that have been adapted into horror movies, or as I said, in one case a TV show, that I also thought were fantastic. So I think a lot of the entries in this list are probably quite obvious ones. They are ones you might expect to see in a list like this, but I do feel that all of them are valid, and I think there's a tendency amongst bookish people, isn't there, to say the book is always better. But I don't think that's always true by any stretch of the imagination. I can think of loads of movies where the movie was better than the book. And I think with all of these ones that I'm going to talk about, the movie was at least as good as the book. So I think these are all really good books, but also all really good movies. So anyway, I'll stop waffling and get on with the list. So the first one is a Stephen King one. There had to be Stephen King on this list, didn't there, given how many Stephen King adaptations there have been. So that is Carrie. So King's first novel came out in 1974, the tale of a teenage girl who's bullied at high school, but who has psychic powers, and her rage manifests itself in glorious destruction at the end of the book. So adapted a couple of years after the book came out, so adapted in 1976 by Brian De Palma, who I think is when he's on form, I think he's an excellent movie director. And I think he's really on form in Carrie. I think some of the visuals in Carrie are fantastic. The kind of use of split screen and things like that in Carrie is just brilliant. And it's got a great cast as well. You've got John Travolta playing, the kind of cheesy jock type character that he does very well. And you've got Sissy Spacek, who's fantastic as Carrie. So a really excellent movie, a really memorable movie. There's some really stark visuals that you just stick in your mind, aren't there, from Carrie. So a really good, solid adaptation of the book, I think. The next one, another one of a kind of similar vintage, so The Exorcist. So the book by William Peter Blatty came out in 1971. The movie, directed by William Friedkin, came out in 1973, the year of my birth, funnily enough. Both excellent. And like Carrie, and indeed I think like a lot of the books and movies I'm going to talk about in this list, it's quite a faithful adaptation. So I think that the adaptation of The Exorcist is quite faithful to the book, and both work really well. And I do think as well with both Carrie and The Exorcist, and indeed other books I will be talking about on this list, these were books that when they came out caused a big splash. They were, immediately successful, and it's probably not a surprise that the movie companies latched onto that success and made movies. But yeah, The Exorcist, an absolutely classic film. The book is very good. I think the film is probably better than the book in this case. So some great performances, and again some fantastically memorable visuals, some really creepy and disturbing scenes, and some of the disturbing content in The Exorcist I think is stuff that works better on screen than it did on the page. Also, a notable film for people like me who are in the UK, because for a long time it was very difficult to see this film in the UK. So when it was originally released in cinemas, which it was in 1973, there were lots of reports of like people having hysterics and things like that when they were watching it, and it ended up getting it didn't get approved to be released on video until I think the late 90s. So local authorities could elect and say that, you know, cinemas in their jurisdiction could show it, and you did occasionally see it in kind of late night movie shows and things like that. But personally, I didn't see it. Despite being born in the year it came out, I didn't see it, I think, until I was in my kind of mid to late 20s. So moving on then to 1981, we have the book that launched the career of one of the most, I guess, notorious and recognisable horror screen villains of recent years, Hannibal Lecter. So the book is Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, which was adapted a few years later in 1986 by Michael Mann as Manhunter. So it was more recently filmed again as Red Dragon, but originally filmed as Manhunter. And Michael Mann was most famous or best known for the TV show Miami Vice. But Manhunter, you know, one of his movies is really excellent, a really taut serial killer thriller based on a really taut serial killer book. So Red Dragon, much like the sequel Silence of the Lambs, is about an investigation into a serial killer where another serial killer, the imprisoned Hannibal Lecter, gets kind of drawn into helping the FBI investigate the murders that are ongoing. Unlike Silence of the Lambs, where you have Clarice Starling, a female investigator, in this book, the FBI agent is a guy. But aside from that, there are a lot of similarities, and it feels like Harris kind of refined his thinking about Lecter and basically, you know, kind of almost wrote the same story again in Silence of the Lambs. Certainly movie-wise, I prefer Manhunter to Silence of the Lambs. Lecter in Manhunter is played by Brian Cox rather than Anthony Hopkins, who obviously played him more famously in Silence of the Lambs and the subsequent films. I think Brian Cox does a better job than Anthony Hopkins. I always found Anthony Hopkins' portrayal a bit kind of too pantomimey and over the top, whereas Brian Cox is kind of quietly chilling. So yeah, a really good movie if you haven't seen it, and the book is a classic of its type. Moving on to something completely different and much trashier. There had to be at least one trashy book and film on this list. So that is Slugs, the book by Sean Hudson from 1982 about a plague of killer slugs attacking a small town in England. Filmed in 1986 by Spanish director J.P. Simon under the same name, Slugs. The movie transplants the action to America, and there are some differences, but you know, basically it's got killer slugs in it. One of the particularly joyful things that the slugs do in both book and film is kind of infect people's brains. So if people eat a bit of lettuce that's been slugged, they get these worms that form in their brains, and which send them insane, and also at various points kind of pop out of their heads. So yeah, it's a lot of very silly, very gory fun. I think the book and film are equally trashy. I think in this case the book is probably slightly better than the film, but the film is still a lot of fun if you like that kind of gory, nasty trash. Going back a few years to something a bit classier, we have Rosemary's Baby. So the book came out in 1967, written by R11, who wrote a string of books that were, you know, that really kind of grasped the public imagination and were successfully adapted into film as well. Rosemary's Baby obviously filmed by Roman Polanski, with Mia Farrow in the role of Rosemary. So both book and film do an excellent job of kind of pulling you into Rosemary's world and her paranoia about, you know, what is happening to her. So both thoroughly entertaining, and again, I think, you know, book and film are equally good. Moving on then to the TV adaptations. This is The Terror, so adapted in 2018 from Dan Simmons' novel of 2007. I've talked about the novel on the channel before. I did a review of it and subsequently watched the TV show. And I think what both the the book and the TV show have is this really epic feel. So it's the story of a doomed expedition to, and I always get it wrong, I never remember if it's the Arctic or the Antarctic. I think it's the Arctic. So this expedition to the Arctic, in kind of Victorian times, where the ships get stuck in the ice and various terrible things happen thereafter, including, you know, attacks by giant polar bears and cannibalism and things like that. So both fantastically chilling, both in their kind of sense of place. You really feel the ice creeping in, but also their kind of depiction of how humans can kind of fracture under that kind of stress. But yeah, both have a really epic feel, and I'm so pleased that they chose to make a TV show of the Terror rather than a movie. So I can't remember how many episodes the TV show was, but kind of about 12, I think. The book is around 800 pages long. So both of them take quite a slow approach to telling that story and really build up the atmosphere. That you get to know loads of different characters and things like that. So they're both quite rich experiences that you just kind of have to sink into. So both work fantastically well. Moving on then, so I've just talked about a very long novel. Now I'm going to talk about a short story. That short story is The Company of Wolves by Angela Carter from her collection of 1979, The Bloody Chamber. So filmed in 1984 by director Neil Jordan. And I think Neil Jordan's a really interesting director. I don't like all of his films, but one of the things I think that's great about him is he can do lots of different things, and he always does them pretty well. So before this, he directed Mona Lisa, the kind of British gangster movie. He went on to make The Crying Game, which is an excellent thriller with a very famous twist. So I think he's a really interesting director, and Company of Wolves is no exception. So The Bloody Chamber, as a short story collection, is a collection of short stories kind of inspired by fairy tales and things like that, and folklore. Company of Wolves in particular is about werewolves, as the title might suggest, and Company of Wolves the movie is very much a werewolf movie, but very different from the other werewolf movies of the time. So if you think kind of early 80s, you've got American Werewolf in London obviously, and The Howling, and The Wolfen as well. So movies like that were quite almost traditional in their telling of werewolf stories in what I would call an American style. So if you think back to the Universal movie The Wolfman, that kind of style where a relatively normal person in a contemporary setting gets turned into a werewolf, and what happens thereafter. Company of Wolves is set in the past and is a rich and kind of visually lush movie that has, is quite slow at times, quite weird and surreal at times, but also has some fantastic werewolf transformations. There's 2 werewolf transformations in this film in particular, which are just brilliant and a very different approach to kind of transformation than the one you get in, say, American Werewolf in London, where you see the character gradually transforming into the werewolf, and it's a morphing of the human body into a wolf body. The transformations, and I won't give them away because they're really effective, but the way they do the transformations in Company of Wolves is completely different and really, really effective. So I think it's a film that's definitely worth watching. It's not as accessible, should we say, as something like American Werewolf in London, but nevertheless an excellent film. And interestingly, Angela Carter wrote the screenplay for it. She previously adapted Company of Wolves as a radio play, and that then got turned into the screenplay. Okay, moving on then to another example of an author adapting their own work for the screen. In this case, they also directed the movie. So the movie is Hellraiser, and the source is a novella called The Hellbound Heart, both obviously by Clive Barker. So this was near the start of Clive Barker's career when he was really hot stuff. So he'd had a lot of critical success with his short story collection, The Books of Blood, which I think is fantastic. I think it still ranks as one of the greatest horror short story collections. Hellraiser was his film debut, and is a fantastic movie. There are some differences between the novella and the film, but not huge ones. And the core of it. So this idea of this guy Frank, who is a a thrill seeker, constantly looking for the next thrill, who goes one step too far when he summons these kind of demonic figures, the Cenobites. Fantastically effective in both, and the film is, you know, famously gory, so that, you know, the gore in that film was, you know, for that time quite extreme, but also quite artistically done. Barker has a, you know, a fantastic eye, so trained as an artist before becoming a writer, and you can really see that in the movie. I think it's one of those examples of a book and a film being different in some ways but complementing each other brilliantly. So both definitely worth checking out. Okay, two more to go through then. So next we have something far less gory than Hellraiser, but still quite creepy, and that's The Witches. So Nicholas Roeg's film of The Witches came out in 1990, based on the Roald Dahl novel of 1983. So Roald Dahl, you know, a very well-known writer of children's fiction. Often his stories are, you know, quite grotesque. They often have quite unpleasant characters. The Witches is really kind of Roald Dahl turned up to 11, I think, in some respects, in that the characters who are, you know, this coven of witches who are, you know, kind of everywhere and hiding in plain sight, are particularly nasty and, you know, particularly obsessed with causing harm to children. So it is, for a children's book, you know, it's definitely got a kind of fairy tale vibe to it, and that kind of level of threat is quite common in fairy tales, but maybe less common in, you know, more contemporary children's fiction. So it's definitely there in The Witches, and the movie, you know, has some very creepy scenes as well. And just this idea of these hideous witches managing to, you know, disguise themselves and exist in normal society is one that I think is probably quite, you know, disturbing for kids. I was already an adult when the movie came out, just about, but even I found it, you know, it is quite scary at times, despite being a kids' film. So finally then, from Japan, we have Ring by Koji Suzuki. So the novel came out in 1991, was then filmed in Japan in 1998. This is one of the few on the list where I think I saw the movie before reading the book. Normally I'm one of those annoying people who has to read the book first. In this case, it wasn't possible for me to read the book when the movie came out because it hadn't been translated into English. So the book was only translated into English 5 years after the film came out in 2003. But both are really good. So the story centres on this cursed videotape where anyone who sees it is doomed to die within 7 days. So a fantastic concept. And one where, you know, clearly it works even better on film than it does in a book, because you're actually having to watch that film yourself as a viewer. So a really great concept, and I think that's something that's common to many of the books on this list, is they've got such a fantastic concept at the heart of them that it was probably easy to get movie versions greenlighted. And even where, you know, maybe the movie diverges from the books in some respects, you still capture the essence of the book by remaining faithful to the central concept. Okay, time for a random book from the shelf. So again, a book that has been translated into a movie, but one where A, it's not horror, and B, I'm not a huge fan of the movie. I have to confess. Anyway, the book is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. The movie, obviously, Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott. So I think, you know, the movie is a much loved movie. I think it is overrated, and I'm also one of the few people who actually prefers the original cinematic version to the director's cut. I found the director's cut just overwhelmingly pretentious with that bloody unicorn and things like that. So yeah, I prefer the original version of the film, and I prefer the book to either version of the film. So I hope you found that interesting. Let me know what you think of the list I came up with, and let me know your favourite horror book to movie adaptations. And as always, hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.